Hi there guys, and welcome to another episode of The Uncast Show. Now today I've got a very special guest on the show. Now you'll have all met my guest cousin, and I want to introduce my guest. I've got my guest right here. So why am I looking at a flash drive? Well, because today's guest is a little different. Today's guest is Unraid 7. Now I'm sure when some of you watch this video, when I show you the features of Unraid 7, you're going to be asking why it says Unraid 6.13 beta. Well, I think the best person to explain that is Tom. So, over to Tom.
As I'm recording the podcast, the current stable release is the 6.12 series. And we're working on 6.13. Like I mentioned, we're fully remote, so we have a way of passing around releases to all the developers. And so 6.13 right now is in our sort of internal alpha or beta stage. And probably the main chunk of work in the OS itself is the ZFS implementation. Okay, so what we decided to do, since there's a lot of changes coming, the pricing model, there's a website coming, our support system, our customer support is going to be totally revamped. Anyway, it seemed natural to retire Unraid 6, and so the next release after Unraid 6.12 series will be Unraid 7. Several key features in there. The primary one is going to be a more complete ZFS implementation.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Tom. So that clears things up and explains things. So let's have a look at what's on this flash drive and have a look at the new features in Unraid 7. Okay, so here we are on a server running Unraid 6.13.0. Beta 2.5. Now, the first thing we'll look at is let's have a look at the kernel this version's running. So we can see here it's running Linux kernel 6.8.10. Now, why this is important is for you guys out there who are running Intel Arc GPUs, well, now for you, Unraid has got full compatibility with your GPU. So that's the kernel. Let's have a look at which version of Docker Unraid's currently running. We can see here it's running version 25.0.2. And also, let's have a look at which libvert and qemu version Unraid is running. And we can see here libvert is 10.0.0 and qemu 8.2.2. Now, going back to settings here, I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but we've got a new setting here. We've got this here called power mode. Now, if I click onto this, we can see we can change the power mode of the server. This server's got an AMD CPU, which gives me 3 options for best power efficiency, balanced operation, or best performance. Now, Intel CPUs might be slightly different. You may only find you've got power efficiency and performance, but whatever you've got and whatever you want to set it to, well, you can set it here. Now, another thing to notice here is we've got another feature here, which wasn't in the previous versions of Unraid, called Outgoing Proxy Manager. So I'm going to click onto that, and this new feature in Unraid is designed to route certain types of network traffic through a specified HTTP proxy server. So here we can actually set that. You can see we can set 3 different outgoing proxy servers. So for this one, I can call it main, and paste in the address of the proxy. And let's put a secondary one in as well. And now I'm going to click on to apply. So what you can see here is this one here, which I made up. There's no proxy service running on this address here. We can see it says not available. But this one here, it is running, so we could use this one. So in order to use the outgoing proxy, we just choose which one we've got set. So I'd choose the main one here, and click on to apply. So what this is doing now is Unraid is routing its traffic through that proxy server. Now, one thing to notice is if we have a look here, it says here that outgoing connections from the web GUI and some system processes will use the proxy service. But it says here, Docker container installs and updates, they'll use the proxy, but the container itself will not use the proxy, so you can't actually run the container through the proxy itself, and also you can't run a VM through. So that's a limitation. If you wanted that, then you'd need to set up a VPN for that to happen, but a really nice addition having an outgoing proxy manager built directly into Unraid. Okay, so back on the settings page, there's something else new here. Now if I hover over an icon, we can see a little heart there. And by clicking onto that, we can add the selected setting to favorites. Now if you have a look up here, before I press the button, just look up here, and when I press it and click OK, well, we can see a new tab is here called Favorites. And now inside here, I've got the power mode setting. So we can add things from settings and from tools. So I'm often using things here. So I'm going to add system devices, upgrade OS, system log, and back to settings. I'm going to add my Tailscale plugin, definitely user scripts, nerd tools, and I think sleep settings. So now all of my favorite settings are in one place, so I don't have to hunt around looking for them. And if I was to remove all of these now, and we've come to the last one, now when I remove this last one, we'll notice the favorites tab will disappear. A really nice feature that the favorites is only populated if we've actually got any favorites here. So another thing to do with finding things, if you notice up here, we've got a search bar. So if I type in, for instance, VPN, I can actually find a part of the GUI which is to do with VPN. So if I click onto VPN Manager here, well, I'm straight into the VM Manager in Unraid. And let's type in VM, and if I'm looking for, say, PCIe ACS override, well, I can easily find that. I can just click onto it, and I'm onto the VM Manager page, and I can find what I'm looking for. So a really nice feature to help us find what we're looking for in the Unraid GUI. Okay, for the next thing, I think I'm going to swap to another server. I'm actually going to go to a server here that's running Unraid 6.12.10. So why am I doing that? Well, I want to show you what the standard dashboard is like in the current stable version of Unraid. So if we have a look here, yep, a really nice dashboard. But what I want to show you is in the new version of Unraid, well, we've got even more than this. So let's go across to my main server here and click onto dashboard. And the first thing we'll notice is we've got the time and date displayed nicely at the top here. And we can see the time is 1944, Monday, May the 20th, 2024. So we can see that's a really nice upgrade from how it was before. Now, something else here, we can see the running Docker containers and the running virtual machines. If I'm just go down a little bit here, you can see here I've got virtual machine usage. So we can see I've got 2 virtual machines running here, and we can see here the CPU usage of the guest CPU. So that's the CPU, the virtual CPU inside the VM. We can see how much it's being stressed out. And underneath, we can see how much the host CPU, or basically the server CPU, is being used in comparison to the guest CPU. Also, we've got various memory statistics, disk statistics, and network statistics as well. Now, something I really like here is how the system's displayed. So we can see the RAM usage here, and we can see here I've got 53% of my RAM, or 66 gigs being used. VM usage here, we can see is 48 gigs, and that's colored orange. And the ZFS cache, I'm using a further 8 gigs, which we can see in the yellow here. And also we get to see how much the flash drive is used, how full the log is, and also how much the Docker vdisk is filled up. So really nice, easy way to see everything, and I think that's a great improvement to how the system used to be displayed. This new version, much more modern and much more easy to see what's happening. Okay, so that's the dashboard. Now let's move on and have a look at some new things and to do with the file system and ZFS. But to do that, I'm going to go across again to another server. So we're over on a server that's running Unraid 6.12. Now you might be asking why on this server with 6.12. Basically, I'm showing you this so we can compare the differences when we create a Z pool. So I'm going to click on Add Pool here, and I'm just going to call it New Z Pool. And I'm going to give it 3 slots. And to those 3 slots, I'm going to add 3 4TB hard drives. With the drives added to the pool, I can choose the type of file system I'm going to use, and I can choose a basic Z pool. I'm going to choose RAID Z here. giving me 1 disk of redundancy and 2 data disks. So with that applied, I can now start up the array and then format the drives. And so with the drives formatted, the Z-pool's been created. But now I can't do anything else with it, and I've got 2 extra disks here. But what I want to show you is if we go to the new version of Unraid, we can actually do something extra to the Z-pool. So I'm going to quickly upgrade from 6.12 to the latest beta. Okay, so now we're booted up into Unraid 6.13.0, beta 2.5. Now my array here is stopped, but if we scroll down here now, under the pool devices, these all being ZFS, we've got the option here to add what's known here as a subpool. So if I click onto this here, we can add various special types of VDEVs. We can add one for metadata storage, a slog, which is basically a write cache for synchronous writes, deduplication tables, a read cache or L2 arc, and a hot spare drive. Now, I really suggest you listen to a recent Uncast podcast with Tom Lawrence from Lawrence Systems, who goes into great detail about all these different VDEV types.
And we'll start with a pool. A pool is where it all begins. You grab a group of drives, they're all belonging to the pool. The first subdivision, doesn't have to be, depends on your setup and what you want, is the VDEVs. We have the data VDEVs, we have special metadata VDEVs, we have the ZIL VDEVs, and we have the read cache VDEVs. There's also a deduplicate one, but we'll just, for simplicity, you're not that likely to get much benefit out of deduplication, so we'll skip over that one.
Right. So yes, if you want to learn more about these VDEV types, and you haven't already, then check out what Tom Lawrence has to say in the previous podcast. So what I'm going to add first is a hot spare. So I'm going to select one slot because I've only really got one drive I can assign as a spare. So I'm going to click add. And now I'm going to choose this other 4 terabyte drive I've got here. So that means now should one of these drives fail, then this hot spare will automatically be added in to the Z-pool to replace the failed drive, and then the disk will be resilvered and the data repopulated. So really cool if you've got a spare drive, having it ready to go should anything bad happen to the pool. Now I've also got this SSD here, so I could add this to the pool as well. Now, to be honest, I don't really need to add it as a read cache because I've got plenty of RAM in this server. There's 128 gigs. But if you didn't have a lot of RAM, you might want to add a read cache. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to click onto Add Pool. And I'm going to choose here L2 arc, again with one slot. And I'm going to add my SSD. Now, if you do add a read cache, it's very important to make sure that it's faster than the main drives in your pool. So if all of these were SSDs, there really would be no point in me adding this cache. But because these are all spinning Rust, well, this SSD could in fact speed up reads from the Z-pool. Okay, so with that done, I'm now going to start up the array again. And so now with the array started, we can see this advanced Z-pool here now, with 3 drives making up the RAID Z data part, the read cache here, and 1 drive here for a hot spare. Now, it's lucky I've got a hot spare, because this drive certainly isn't young. Okay, so here we are now on a server that I use mainly for VMs. And yes, I did say earlier that beta 2.5 was the newest. Well, beta 2.6 is now newer, and there's an awesome feature here that I want to show you. Now, this server is a pure ZFS server of mainly NVMEs and SSDs, but you'll notice at the top here there's an array disk which is actually a USB flash drive. Well, that's because up until this release, it was a prerequisite that we had to have at least one disk assigned into the array, so what myself and many others would do was use a USB flash drive as a placeholder to fulfill that criteria and just run pools inside the server. Well, now with this release, we don't have to do that anymore. We don't actually have to have an Unraid array at all. So here I'm removing the disk and then setting the slots to 0. After that, I need a new configuration, so I'm going to go to Tools, New Config. Here I'm going to select Preserve All, Yes, and Apply. So now back across onto the main tab, I'm going to scroll down and click onto Start, and that will bring up the server booted up purely with pools and no Unraid Array. So now the Unraid Array type is totally optional, and you can choose how to construct your server from whatever you want. Okay, so for the next new features, we're going to head across to one of my other servers again. So we're over on my other server here, Serenity. And what I want to show you is what I'm really excited about is the new VM feature. Well, I showed you earlier that on the dashboard, we get the virtual machines usage, and this can be turned on and off if we go to Settings, VM Manager, and enabling or disabling show VM usage. This turns that on and off. I'm leaving mine on. And if we go to the VMs tab here, well, we get to see the same VM usage statistics here on the VMs page. I think it's really useful to be able to see the guest CPU usage and the other usage metrics that we can see here. Okay, so I think the best way to show the new VM features is we should just go ahead and create a new VM, and then I can show most of them during the creation process. So let's click on Add New VM, and let's choose a Windows 10 here. And we'll name it Windows 10 Test VM. Now, the first new thing we can see here is where it says Override Storage Location. Now, obviously, it's set to default, but we can change it from the default here to choose the location where this VM will put its vdisk. So here we can see the pools that I've got in the server. I've got Ancient, Atlantis, and the new Z pool that we just created. And we can also see part of the new Z pool, the special VDEVs. Obviously, we can't put it on here because it says 0 bytes free. And if we were to try, it would just fall back to the default because there's no space free. And my other choice would be to put it on disk 1. So the default location for me at present, if we have a look at my shares, and I'm sure all of you guys already know that the share that Unraid keeps its vdisks in is called domains. And this one here, for its primary storage, is set to Atlantis, and I don't have any secondary storage defined. And this storage location Atlantis here, I chose that because on this server, it's the only NVMe that I've got in the whole of the server, so it's my fastest storage. So let's go back to the VM here, and we're going to override the default location and make this new test VM created on that new Z pool. Because obviously I don't need this test VM to be highly performant on my fastest storage, I'm just going to put it on the Z pool. And after we've created this VM, we'll go and look on those disks and see where the vdisk is. Now the next thing we can see here, next to CPU mode, is we've got this option here, migratable, which by default is set to on, but we can also turn this off. By default in qemu KVM, this option is always set to on to support what's called live migration. This is a feature that allows you to move a running VM from one physical host to another with minimum downtime. Now, obviously in Unraid, we're not migrating live running VMs from one host to another. So now we've got the option to actually change the default and turn this off. So what this means basically is better performance. Why? Because we've got reduced overhead without the need to maintain this migration ready state. So the CPU resources are more efficiently utilized because we disabled these migration related tasks. So my suggestion on your VMs is just set this to off. And so that's what I'm going to do here. Okay, so let's give this VM some cores and some RAM. Now what we'll notice here is the machine type is up to 8.2, so i440FX 8.2, and the same for the Q35 here. Now obviously this relates to what we were looking at earlier when we looked at the VM settings and we saw the qemu version was 8.2.2. So when you're creating your VM, just always use the highest version of either i440FX or Q35. Okay, so moving on. Let's give this VM a 500 gig vdisk, nothing new here. But if we scroll down a bit more, we can see another new function here called multifunction. Now this is grayed out if we're using a virtual GPU, but if we're to pass through a real GPU, say this 2080 Ti here, then this function we can turn it on. Now what this does is when we add the sound counterpart of the GPU, is it puts both of these on the same virtual bus inside of the VM, which gives better performance for the GPU when it's passed through. Now, previously we could do this, but it involved complex XML edits, and so now we can do all of this straight from the GUI, which will give us better performance in VMs with pass-through GPUs. Okay, so scrolling down more, when we get to the bottom here, we can see a button Create VM, because this is the end of the basic settings in the VM creation. But if we go down a bit further here, we can see here advanced tuning options. And I'll show you these features in more detail in a moment when I show you a VM I have that's actually using these features. But for now, just a super brief overview. Here we can add something called qemu command line args. Like before, we used to have to put this in the XML and it was much more difficult to do. And also, if you ever came back to the VM template and updated the template, those changes would go. Now they all stick, we can put them in here and it's super easy. We're able to change the clock's offset from local time to UTC. The timer source, we can select all these different types, whether they're present in the VM or not. And another really cool feature here is we've got something called evdev pass-through straight in the GUI. But like I said, we'll look at these in a moment. So for now, let's just create our VM. Okay, so the VM's all created here. And if I click onto it here, we can see that the new vdisk is still created in the domain share, but we can see its location here is the pool new zpool. And let's just go across there quickly and have a look. So if I go into new zpool here, we can see because I changed the default location for the vdisk, well, now we can see it's inside this zpool. Okay, so to show you the next new features, to make it easier, I'm going to swap out this GPU and put in a virtual GPU so we can easily see the VM when it's running. Okay, so I've swapped the GPU for a virtual one. So now let's have a look at the VM now it's running. And here we can actually see yet another feature. So as always, we can start the VM in VNC console, but we can also pass it through to remote viewer VNC software instead of opening it in the browser. Well, I'm going to open mine in the browser here. So here I've just got a basic Windows 10 VM with just one file here called Big Buck Bunny, which is basically a copyright-free video file, and you'll see why we've got this here in a moment. But for now, let's just shut down this VM. Hopefully there won't be any Windows updates. Okay, and so with the VM shut down, I can show you some more features. If we look here now under this column, we can see the vdisks and virtual CDs. Here straight away we can see we've got a 500 gig vdisk, and I've got 0 out of 2 available virtual CDs. So if I want to actually add a CD, I can click on here and select the ISO image and do it directly from here without having to actually go into the VM template. So let's add this here. It's a Linux distro ISO, but we'll still be able to see it in Windows. Let's click on to update. And now we can see there's 1 out of 2 VCDs attached to this VM. Now, if we look under here, it says snapshots none. So snapshots, hey, well, now we can actually take snapshots of our VMs straight from the GUI. And this is really awesome. So to do that, we just click here. And if we scroll down here, you can see we've got both clone and create snapshot. So as well as being able to create snapshots, we can also clone VMs as well. So anyway, let's actually create a snapshot now. So I'm going to click on here and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this base and click proceed. And so now here we can see it says we've got 1 snapshot. Okay, so let's start back up the VM. Okay, so let's install some software onto this VM. Okay, so now we've got 2 new pieces of software. We've got Chrome and Foxit Reader. So now let's just shut down the VM. And now let's restore the snapshot we took earlier. Now if we scroll here, we can see here's the snapshot that we took. We can see here it's called base and memory here is set to no. Okay, so I'm going to click on the snapshot here and I'm just going to click revert snapshot. And let's start back up the VM. And now we're back to where we were before without Chrome and Foxit Reader installed. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what I think is the really, really cool part. So I'm going to start playing this video file here. Okay, and let's move it on roughly to about the middle. Okay, so the video is around the kind of 5-minute mark here. So now with the VM running, I'm going to create another snapshot. So again, I'm going to click Create Snapshot. So just as before, we can give it a name. And if you see here, it says memory dump, and that's checked. Because that's checked here, it means it's also going to dump all of the working memory of the running VM. So let's click on to proceed and make the snapshot. Okay, so we've created the snapshot here, and we can see that the memory type now is external. So let's go back across to the VM, and we can close this. Now, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to delete the video file and empty the recycle bin, and let's shut down the VM. And now let's go ahead and restore that snapshot. Okay, so the snapshot's restored, and we can see the VM's already running. So let's go back into the VM, and here you can see, still just over 5 minutes, the VM's fully restored, the video file's here, and everything in RAM, because it's still actually playing the video file. So the snapshot, an absolutely awesome feature, it can snapshot absolutely everything inside a running VM. Oh yeah, and before we shut down the VM, let's just go here to the File Explorer. We can see here there's that virtual CD ISO that we attached earlier. It being a Linux ISO, we can't run it on Windows, but what we can do is we don't need to shut the VM down. We can come along here and we can swap this for another ISO whilst the machine's running. So if I click on Update here and pop back across to the VM, we can see this has changed. And here's the Windows 10 ISO. So pretty cool, we don't need to shut down the VM in order to swap out ISO images. Okay, so let's move on and look at some of the advanced features in the VM template. So I'm going to edit this Windows 98 VM here, and I'm going to scroll down. And for the Windows 98 VM, I have to use CBIOS. Obviously, Windows 98 knows nothing about UEFI. So if I scroll down here, you can see here I've passed through a very old GPU, a Voodoo 3DFX. But the problem's been, in recent versions of KVM qemu, that passing through a GPU to a CBIOS VM, when you'd start up the VM, you'd have a black screen. And so if using CBIOS, there's something we can do, is we add something called a qemu override. Now, I'm not going to go into it in this video. I'll probably make a video about it sometime in the future. But in previous versions of Unraid, we couldn't even add it to the XML. It would always get stripped out because it wasn't compatible. But now we can just add it straight in to the qemu command line part here, straight into the GUI. So yeah, basically this makes it, when you pass through a GPU to a CBIOS machine, no more black screen. And the other custom part at the top here just emulates a Pentium 3 CPU. And now if we scroll down here, what I've done here in this VM is I've changed the timer configuration. I've disabled HPET here because Windows 98 doesn't support it. I've disabled the Hyper-V clock here, again because this is just specific to newer versions of Windows, and so it won't benefit my Windows 98. But what I have done is I've enabled the real-time clock here, as this is a traditional timer that was used by older operating systems. And also you can see here I've enabled the PIT timer here, again being another timer that was used in older operating systems. Now I'm sure for most people you probably never have to touch these things, but it's an awesome feature for advanced users when we want to tweak things. And if you see down here, we've got this evdev device pass-through. Now evdev stands for Event Device Pass-through. And what this allows us to do, it's another way of passing through a keyboard and mouse. evdev input pass-through is a way to let our virtual machines use input devices, like keyboards and mice, etc., directly using the evdev driver. It's super low latency because it taps straight into the event devices at the system's kernel level, skipping all the middle steps. So this makes your input feel almost as fast if it were using the hardware directly on the main machine. It's going to be less latency than if we passed it through as a USB device here, And arguably, it's even faster than if you pass through a whole USB controller with a keyboard and mouse attached. Now, other benefits as well, you can pass it through to an operating system that maybe doesn't support USB keyboards and mice. But maybe a more practical benefit is if you see here where it says grab toggle, we can set this so a key combination, whilst the VM is running, can give the keyboard back to the host. So why would this be an advantage? Well, say you're booting up Unraid and you've got two monitors. One might be connected to your iGPU and you might be running Unraid in GUI mode. So obviously you can control the server from your keyboard and mouse and start up a VM. Then when the VM started, you can use that same keyboard and mouse and control the VM and use it as normal. But also, if you need to, you can just swap back to the host whenever you want and do other things on the Unraid server. So yeah, it might be a bit of a niche use case, but pretty cool all the same, I think. Okay, and so the last thing we're going to look at is when making a VM, especially if you've got a lot of custom things in your template, you're not always going to want to have to put them in manually yourself each time. So what you can do is if I click here, create modify template, I can create my own custom template. So obviously I'm going to call this Windows 98 and click OK. And so then to use our custom template, all we do is go down to the bottom and hit add VM. And at the bottom here, we can see user templates. Now here's a Windows one that I've set up before. And here's the custom Windows 98 one. Looks like I carelessly left off the S on Windows. Okay, so if we click onto this here, here's the template. Now, obviously, because I've already got a Windows 98 VM, if I was going to add this, I would change the name. But you can see here that everything is exactly the same as how I set it up before. Now, of course, we'd have to add a VDisk for the install. We'd just set that here. And everything else is all pre-filled in from how we set up the template. My GPU is already here, so I don't need to put that in again. And again, a really big time saver if I'm setting up a new Windows 98 VM. All of my custom qemu command line stuff's already there, along with my timer sources here. And of course, last but not least, all of my evdev information. So it's easy as that. You just click on to create if you wanted to create the custom VM. Obviously, I'm not going to because I've already got a Windows 98 VM. Not even I need to. Now, I know I said that was the last thing I was going to show you, but if you folks have got a bit more time, I'll show you something else. Now, if we go here and say we're creating a Windows 11 VM, and this feature, it isn't exclusive to Windows 11 VMs. It works with any VMs we can create. Now, I chose a Windows 11 VM because Windows 11 supports native Android emulation through its Windows subsystem for Android. That allows us basically to run Android apps on our Windows machines. But to run the Windows subsystem for Android, storage must be an SSD. Normal hard drives aren't supported. Now, normally when you create a VM, even if your VDisks are stored on an SSD, the hypervisor presents the VDisk to the guest operating system as just a normal hard drive. So this would mean that even if our VDisk is on an SSD, well, no Android subsystem for Windows for us. Well, unless we use this new feature, that is, which will tell the guest operating system that this VDisk is an SSD. This isn't available if our primary VDisk bus is virt.io, but if we change it to SCSI, SATA or IDE, we get this SSD option. And I'd recommend using SCSI. Well, with that we can check this SSD flag here, and now the VDisk will be presented to the guest OS as an SSD. And so again, yep, another really nice feature. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for this episode of the Uncast Show. Now, I really hope you're as excited about Unraid 7 as I am, and I'm sure you all are. Now, hang on, don't stop watching just quite yet. I'm going to show you one last thing right at the end of this video. But just before I do, remember what I'm showing you today is the beta version of 7. Things no doubt will change before the official stable version hits the streets. So I'm going to shut down this server now, and when I do, you're going to see the last new feature. We've got a greatly improved shutdown and reboot screen. Not only does it look a lot better, but we get to see much more information during the shutdown or reboot process. Well, this really is the end of the episode now, so thank you everyone for joining us to take this quick look at Unraid 7. Now remember, if you haven't subscribed to the Uncast Show yet, Please hit the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you in another episode of the Own Car Show, where next time I have a human guest.